The publication Vice has kind of set off an interesting debate with an article they published. New report warns high likelihood of human civilization coming to an end within 30 years. So that's pretty bad. And that what they were doing is they were summarizing a study from or a publication from the Breakthrough National Center for Climate Restoration, which is an Australian think tank. And basically, what it said is that the IPCC report understates how much harm climate change will do, and that the runaway feedback effects that are amplifying the warming from CO2 are going to make the Earth largely uninhabitable. And it doesn't say that the body of the article doesn't say that will happen in 30 years, but that 30 years will be the tipping point where we really can't do anything to stop it. And there was some pushback from climate scientists. In fact, there was one detailed response from 6 researchers who said that the claims in the report were overstated, and then the claims in Vice's article were even more overstated. And just one example, one of the climate scientists said, the report's authors have merely read or possibly seen without actually reading a few of the scariest papers they could find, misunderstood or not properly read at least one of them, and presented unjustified statements. So pretty damning stuff. But the researchers went on to say, like, look, this is still a catastrophic problem. You don't need to oversell it. And a headline from Vox really captured the flavor of the debate, which was, will climate change kill everyone or just lots of people, or lots and lots of people? And so what you're really seeing is this mainstream debate about whether climate change is catastrophic threat or an existential threat. And if you look, like, so what's the whole basis for this debate is, look, we have a pretty good sense of how climate is going to respond to CO2 thanks to reliable climate models. And so now it's just like, how dead are we going to be? And at the same time this debate was going on online, the New York Times published a really interesting op-ed called "Is Climate Change Inconvenient or Existential? Only Supercomputers Can Do the Math." And the author was Sabine Hosenfelder, a research fellow at the Frankfurt Institute, fellow at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies. And Sabine points out that according to the IPCC's 2014 report, predictions from about it was based on predictions from about 24 computer models. And she says, I assume it's a she, but Sabine is an unknown name to me, so maybe Stefan can correct me. While similar in methodology, the models arrive at somewhat different long-term projections. They all agree the Earth will continue to warm, but disagree on how much and how quickly. And I mean, that by itself is a pretty big red flag. That is, if we have this really good understanding of the climate, it should at least be a question. Well, then why do the models disagree significantly enough that a researcher is pointing this out? But then Hossenfelder goes on to argue that there's one particular equation that can't be solved at present that creates huge uncertainty in climate predictions. It's and I might botch this pronunciation too, but the Navier-Stokes equation, which is the formula used to calculate changes of the atmosphere and oceans. And the article says the Navier-Stokes equation, central to predicting Earth's climate, is famously difficult to solve and has caused mathematicians and physicists headaches for 200 years. It is knowledge we urgently need. As Earth continues to warm, we face a future of drought, rising seas, and extreme weather events. But for all we currently know, this situation could be anywhere between a mere annoyance and an existential threat. And so Hossenfelder's view is we need to spend about $1 billion on supercomputers that can work out this equation and tell us what we need to know. But just this, like, if the science is settled and if the only debate is catastrophe or existential threat, and if all we have to do is listen to the scientists, then, like, why do we need this? If mere annoyance is actually on the table, why is that not at all discussed? And anyone who does discuss it is labeled a denier. And I think this points to a point that you made in the moral case for fossil fuels, Alex, but that is it's treated as off the table, which is that the whole foundation here is climate models that have not successfully been able to predict the future paths of climate. And it really illustrates that we have a gigantic lack of understanding here, and that nobody takes that into account, or you're not even allowed to acknowledge that, um, except in this particular case in the New York Times.
All right, I have a lot to say about this. Let me just start with the issue of climate prediction, which I think there's a bunch of ambiguity there that's worth resolving. So, in a sense, we can divide climate related prediction into, I think you could think of it as, I tend to divide it into three categories, although you can simplify it into two categories. So the version of the three category version is you can divide it into how good are we at predicting the change in average temperature. That's kind of one thing, because the whole theory of catastrophic climate change, or at least the claim of catastrophic climate change, the fundamental driver of problems is warming by a rise in greenhouse gases. So there's the question of, okay, when you increase greenhouse gases, particularly CO2, what does that do to temperatures over time? So that's one thing that where prediction is needed. And then another aspect of prediction is when temperatures rise, what happens to other aspects of the climate system, of the global climate system. So that can be, what happens to, what kind of influence does it have on sea levels? What kinds of influence does it have on rain patterns? And then that itself can influence drought and storms and a bunch of other things. And there's also wildfires, but you can think of it as, okay, the warming influence. So there's like the warming influence of CO2, and then there's the broader climate influence of warming. So that's part two. And then three is, you can think of it as like the climate influence on human flourishing. So you have, like, again, rising CO2 causes some amount of warming. That warming causes some amount of broader climate change. That broader climate change has some sort of influence on human flourishing. Now, so this is a human flourishing perspective on it, which is, I think, is the proper perspective. So if we look at how well are both of those understood, I'm curious about Stefan's view on the first two, but I would regard as the first two are pretty poorly understood, and probably a second is considerably worse understood than even the first. And so when we talk about climate prediction models not being able to predict climate, and we talk about the uncertainty there, there's a huge uncertainty in terms of how much influence this has, although we've had a long time of increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and it hasn't been anything very dramatic. And I don't believe there's been anything very dramatic climate-wise. So that's definitely a positive indication. And we know things like, well, CO2 levels have been 10 or 20 times higher in the past, and temperatures have been much higher, and that kind of thing. But so there's a lot of uncertainty about what the climate system. But in terms of how the climate system impacts human flourishing, we actually have enormous confidence in that. And but it really depends on our understanding of human nature, because the way that most people who are talking about climate prediction treat human beings is that a change in climate conditions will fundamentally disrupt human beings' now stable existence. So there's this idea of, well, we depend on unstable climate conditions, and if those change, so if that situation is destabilized, then, we were used to growing crops one place and now we're not going to be able to, or we're used to having more water here and now we're not going to have it. And then they see it as, well, we have this system that depends on a particular set of climate conditions, and when those conditions change, then it's going to be a disaster. And they just run these simulations in effect. Sometimes they have simulations, sometimes they just have their own conclusions. But the idea is that they treat what we can call like the human flourishing system, or the human life system now, which is a huge part of it is you can think of it as economic system. They treat that as a fairly stable and static thing, where changing conditions destabilize and ultimately harm it. And this is very much a view held by a lot of people in the environmental sciences and people talking about this. But it's important that this is a known false view. That is that human economic systems are stable, and that changes in conditions, even significant changes in conditions, lead to their decline. The way that the human flourishing system works is it's a very dynamic system. So it's a system where we are constantly dealing with changing conditions, and the overwhelming source of those changing conditions are our own economic advancements. So you think things like, well, we increase the number of people, and so we have to make changes there, or we use iron ore in a certain place, and then it's no longer in that place, so we need to use something else. Or computers come along, and that totally changes what's valuable and what's not, and where it makes sense to use resources, and that changes people's jobs and whatnot. The human life, like the human flourishing system, is a constant process of adaptation and mastery in the face of changing conditions. And it's generally one where the conditions are always changing, and life is overall getting better because we are a dynamic species, at least when we are left free. So when people talk about things like, oh, well, temperatures will go up, or storm patterns will change, or rainfall patterns will change, like, all of those things are things that sea levels rise, and particularly because you're talking about fairly long time scales, human beings are completely able to deal with those kinds of changing conditions. And really, above all, the science of economics should really be voicing this and telling us this, that we are just incredibly, incredibly good at dealing with changing conditions, whether they come just from the natural environment, whether they come within our own economic system, or whether they come from the side effects of our economic system on the natural environment, which is the claim of climate influence. Basically, there are activities that we're pursuing, energy and productivity and flourishing, that has a side effect, and that's going to change climate conditions in some general way over some period. So when we talk about, oh, well, climate models don't work and stuff like that, it's important that the most important piece of the equation, which is how human beings deal with climate conditions, is both very well understood and very positive. And it is completely being ignored by most people who would consider themselves scientifically savvy. So the science of, I mean, there isn't even a good name for this because it's partially economics, but it's basically like the science of human flourishing, the science of human action, and specifically with, you can call it the science of human mastery. This is something that we are incredibly that's there's a lot of available knowledge. We can have a lot of confidence, and we know that we can deal with all sorts of changes in conditions. I think that is, and then of course, if you get that, then you are much less afraid of different kinds of changes in climate conditions. But on the other hand, you are more afraid of anything that changes the fundamental conditions that mastery requires. And so, what does mastery require? Well, mastery definitely requires freedom. So it requires that we are free to think and act in different conditions and as conditions change. That is essential. If the law forces us to be static, then that will be catastrophic, uh, particularly just given the nature of life and how dynamic life is. And then we need to be free, but then we need to be free also to take the kinds of actions that give us mastery. And one of those kinds of actions is we need to be able to produce energy so that we can use machines to master our lives and master our environment. And that's why all of these policies to threaten energy abundance are so deadly, because when we have energy abundance, that's an indispensable ingredient in our mastery of our environment. And if we have that ingredient along with freedom, we can do so much, and we really don't have to be worried about a whole lot. But if we take away that ingredient, if we take away energy abundance, then we are very, very crippled. Like kind of, even if we have everything else, but we just take away energy abundance, well, then we don't have much ability to use machines. And then no matter how smart we are, we're mostly left with manual labor. And that gives us very little power to act, to do work. And it also prevents us from using all of these amazing machines that don't work via manual labor, like computers. So it's really interesting how there are all these different speculations, but what what is really the thing that's really known is that human beings with energy abundance and freedom can deal with any kind of changing conditions. And I think that changing climate conditions are nowhere near the list of the top challenges that we will face. But a challenge that we can't cope with would be deprivation of energy, and that's what's being proposed. One final perspective on this is just that I find it very, very helpful to just think of energy much as you think of medicine or drugs, like prescription drugs, including, or you can include vaccines here. And just whenever I hear any of these claims, I just think about benefits and side effects. So if somebody is saying, oh, well, we're like, I'm sure this will come up in later stories because you just see it all the time, but they'll say, like, oh, fossil fuels, like fossil fuel air pollution kills X number of people. And if you just translate that to vaccines, you see a story that says vaccine side effects killed X number of people. You think that is a bad story because you can't talk about what the side effects are doing independent of the benefits. And if you just look at the side effects, you think, oh God, those vaccines are terrible. But if you look at the benefits, then you have a very, very different evaluation. So thinking of, I mean, these are very two related points, but the second point that I've made is just the thinking of energy and particularly fossil fuels in terms of the benefits and the side effects, just like you would any kind of medical choice that you're making. And then recognizing that whatever our uncertainty about climate prediction, we have enormous available certainty about human mastery over changing climate conditions and changing any kind of other conditions.